Okay, welcome back to day 3. We're going to kind of switch things up a little bit. We're still going to watch some videos and things of that nature. We're going to talk a little bit about alcohol and the effects of drinking and driving. You may already know some of them. North Carolina's .08, but you can get charged otherwise, a little lower as well. And there's 3 little video clips that we're going to watch. The first one an attorney talks about the levels of punishment. Keep in mind the video, the levels of punishment, was made probably about 2014, so it's got some age to it. So the fees and stuff like that may be a lot different than what it would be today. Okay, but still, you kind of get an idea. Also, too, there's another one that we'll watch. Talks about the insurance. Remember earlier in the previous videos, I mentioned to you that you get a speeding ticket, you get 3 points, but then you get insurance points as well. And so this guy here on the next video, he's insurance guy, and so he talks more about how many points you get, things of that nature, and then that way you kind of see. I'll get back at the end of these videos. And then the third video is a counselor. We're not going to watch all of it because he's got like a 3-part series, but we'll watch a few minutes of it. He talks about how much really .08 is, and there's actually a mathematical formula that goes into determining .08 or .10 or whatever the case may be. It's still the same formula. It's not just something that they've randomly grabbed out of the air. This way you kind of get an idea. See, what you don't realize, some people do, some people don't. It's not a DWI. Obviously, you could potentially kill someone, damage property, go to jail, pay hefty fines. Yeah, okay, that's on me. However, if you're a teenager, if your family's got you on their insurance in some capacity, it could affect their homeowners. It could affect another discount. So if you're a teenager and you're living at home with your parents, it could actually devastate them as well, not only with you and all the legal issues you would face and consequences and permanent situations, health damage or injuries and stuff like that. It hurts your parents as well, and those who are living at home. Also, too, the counselor talks about the amount of alcohol, and this is really fascinating to me personally, because I would have never dreamt. I was misinformed for so many years on what .08, .10, .10 used to be what it was back before 1983, but now it's .08, and I would think, if I'm not certain, but I would think the majority of the country, if not all of the country, is at .08 now. So give me a minute to get everything organized, and we'll get to it.
Talk to you a little bit about driving while impaired and the levels of punishment associated with driving while impaired. Now, in North Carolina, there's a scale that the court will utilize, and you will fall into this scale for purposes of sentencing. So a lot of people will call us up on the telephone and ask us, what am I facing? What will the court be fining me? What will my jail time be, if any? And so I feel like it's important for us to kind of go through this. A lot of these things have changed a little bit. December 1st is a new date with respect to new laws related to DWI, and at our law firm, we're on top of it, we're ready, and we're certainly here to answer your questions. But let's kind of walk through this. The court considers things like mitigating an aggravating circumstances when it makes a determination as it relates to where you're going to fall within the scale. You want to, obviously you don't want to have any DWI charge at all, but if you're charged with driving while impaired and you're found guilty, you can find yourself in one of 5 categories. 5 being the least severe, 1 being the most severe. Now as you go from 5 to 1 or 1 to 5, depending on how the court looks at your circumstances, what you're going to be facing is a balancing test that the court conducts as it relates to aggravating circumstances and mitigating circumstances. The term aggravating means it makes it worse. For example, when someone aggravates you or agitates you, it makes the situation worse. The term mitigating means it takes away from the aggravation, or it makes it less bad in one sense. So when you hear these terms bantered about, that's what the court is talking about. Aggravating circumstances are circumstances that the court takes into consideration like this. Let's say you take a breathalyzer test and you blow 0.15 or greater. Now in North Carolina, legally, it's 0.08 to be considered intoxicated. Now, don't take that to mean that you will not get charged if you blow 0.06. Like I said on other tapes, they will charge you depending on how you act and how you respond. So I've had clients come in with a 0.07, 0.05, even a 0.03 at one point. But if you have a 0.15 blood alcohol content or greater, that will be considered an aggravating factor. If there was a dangerous accident, meaning that if you hit someone else while driving, while impaired, that will be considered an aggravating factor. If you have prior convictions which are older than 7 years, in other words, if it was 7 years and 1 day and you had a DWI conviction at that time, they'll look at that prior conviction as an aggravating factor. Now, what they consider to be grossly aggravating, in other words, over-the-top aggravating, would be if you had a DWI charge within the last 7 years. So if it's 6 years and 11 months and 29 days and you get a DWI, that's going to be considered a grossly aggravating factor, which will move you up in this scale where you don't want to be. If there's a child under the age of 16 in your vehicle and you're intoxicated, they will see that as a grossly aggravating factor. If you're driving a vehicle and you're intoxicated and your license has been revoked, that's a grossly aggravating factor. So the court will take into consideration all of these things. Now, the word mitigating, like we said, kind of takes away from that. So let's say that you blew a 0.09, but you had a child in the car under the age of 16. Well, the court's going to look at these scales. It'll say, well, grossly aggravating factors, where do they fall? In 3 or 2? Do they fall in 4? That's where we come in. We really help make those arguments by virtue of research and case law, and by virtue of our experience in the courtroom. It's important for you to understand these things. It can be very technical at times and very confusing, even to the best judges. A lot of times, a prosecutor will simply say, I think they're a level 3. Well, a level 3 versus a level 4 is a difference between 6 months or 120 days. Or $1,000 fine and $500 fine. Well, that's a big difference. If you've had a pretrial assessment, which we have great coordination in our office to get you through your pretrial assessment, that's all done before we ever even step into the courtroom. And it makes believe that basically it takes the court to a point where you have been reviewed and you have been determined to have not a drinking problem. Another mitigating factor is whether or not you have a safe driving record. We pull your driving record, we go to the DA, we go to the judge, and we say, listen, here's the situation. John Doe has done a good job driving, made a mistake on New Year's Eve party, made a mistake at a birthday party, drank more than .08, and as a result was charged with DWI. But the safe driving is a mitigating factor. We want to have more mitigating factors than we want to have aggravating factors. And that goes into the final part of what I'm telling you about today. We want you at a level 5, if we can get you there. Level 5 is a $200 fine, plus you're going to have court costs. Now those court costs vary. North Carolina is having some economic difficulties, and as a result they up the court costs. And so the client thinks, well, I'm only going to have to pay $200. No, that's not true. You're going to have to pay $200 plus whatever the court costs. There'll be a 60-day imprisonment associated with the DWI. Don't freak out. That imprisonment will typically be suspended. So you'll hear the word suspended. If during the period of time, those 60 days, you do something else, like violate any of the court's orders, drive when you shouldn't drive, that 60 days can be invoked and you can find yourself in jail. You'll have 24 hours of community service. You'll have to have that substance abuse assessment, the pretrial assessment like we're talking about. If there are some aggravating factors, meaning that you may have run a .15 or greater, you might find yourself at a level 4. Level 4 is a $500 fine, 120 days in jail, 72 hours of community service. And you can see as we're going down from 5 to 1, you find yourself getting in the aggravating zone. Let's say you had a previous DWI within 7.5 years, let's say, but there was an accident. Someone was hurt. The court will take that into consideration. You may find yourself at a level 3, 6 months, 72 hours, $1,000 fine. And as we go down, level 2, $2,000, 12 months. 72 hours community service, 90 hours of continuous alcohol monitoring, which is a new requirement under the law. And of course, you find yourself at a level 1, you don't want to be there, but if you find yourself there, you're looking at a minimum of a fine of around $4,000, 24 months in jail, and the court can levy what other punishment it wants to. Now, please don't think that that's all you can be charged with. There's a myriad of charges that can be assessed to a DWI situation. Our firm is...
Okay. You can see some of the aggravating and mitigating and grossly aggravating terms that this attorney mentioned. There's a lot of them, like he was trying to say. There's a lot of different charges that they could come up with that you could break the law with. And he just gave a brief little overview. Like I said, I'm not so much worried if you can't see or have to memorize the fees. That's his fees. And then of course he said add court costs, so your attorney may have different fees. Obviously I would imagine there would be more because this is about a 6-year-old video. Alright, this next one is about insurance. Excuse me. And how it affects different the DUI. Well, the DWI will affect just not your pocketbook as far as insurance. It'll affect your parents or your homeowners if you're an adult and so forth. So we're not going to watch all the video. This will give you an idea.
Hi, I'm James Minnick, the North Carolina DWI guy. Today we're talking with Lee Barrett from Asheville Insurance. He's going to tell us a little bit about the impact of a DWI on your auto insurance policy. So Lee, tell us first of all, just kind of how does a DWI impact insurance?
Well, the first thing that's going to happen after your conviction, it's going to show up on the MVR reports, which is public information that all of the insurance.
And what's that MVR? What is
That's
that?
the motor vehicle report
Okay.
that in our state comes out of Raleigh.
Okay.
And the insurance companies are going to pick it up very quickly. And they're going to assess 12 insurance points against your driver's license / insurance policy, which could mean 350% increase in your auto insurance.
Okay. If you live out of state, is that going to...
Let me stop there real quickly. My son, who's 19 at the time of this recording, he has a small car. It's paid for just for liability insurance. We talked a little bit about liability as we go on later on. His insurance right now, with no points on his license or insurance policy, is $195 a month. Now, hopefully you heard where he said there's 350% increase. That's a lot of money for a 19-year-old or anyone else. So now his policy goes from, his premium goes from $195 a month if he were to get DWI and get convicted, from $195 a month to $682 a month, which basically would say it's not worth it. So you multiply that times 12. Now keep in mind, it's also, anytime you get a ticket or DWI, it's on your insurance for 3 years, not just a couple months, but 3 long years. So that means $682.50 times 36. So after the end of 3 years, Andrew, my son, will spend $24,570 for 3 years just to have liability. He could purchase a new car. He could pay for his tuition at his university. He could put down a down payment for a house. You know, he could go on a nice trip. Get him a nice sports car. Okay. So you can see where not only that first video we saw the attorney's fees and know the consequences of being convicted. Now we're digging a little deeper in our pocketbook with insurance.
All insurance companies share their data through what they call the CLUE report. And all of the motor vehicle departments are online. So we are seeing a lot of reciprocation between other states. So if you live in Tennessee, if you're convicted in North Carolina, it's going to travel to Tennessee, be picked up on your insurance in Tennessee.
Okay. And do you see a lot of companies that, as a result of the DWI, will drop a policyholder?
Almost all of your, what I call preferred type companies, these are the companies that you see advertising on television, where your mutual companies that are owned by the policyholder. They are looking at the preferred market. If you fall into that particular bucket, you can almost guarantee that once they find out that the DUI exists, they are going to strip away the physical damage coverage, your comp and your liability insurance, because you're now considered high risk. They're going to lower your limits down to the state minimum, put you in the reinsurance facility, and still hit you with that 350% rate increase.
Okay. And if that policy is dropped as to the auto insurance, or if it becomes kind of a situation where there would be kind of no reason to keep the policy because the coverage has become so bad, is that going to affect other types of insurance that you might have with that company, or the rates that you're paying for, let's say, life insurance or homeowners insurance and that type of thing?
Absolutely, primarily on the home. North Carolina is underpriced in the home market. We're about the fourth cheapest state in the nation. And because of that, many of the preferred and mutual companies were requiring the auto policy, which is profitable, to offset the home insurance. So when they lose the auto piece, then they will elect to either non-renew your home, or they'll raise your deductible extremely high. You'll lose the multi-policy discounts, which will, again, all of that will equal a substantial rate increase on the home side.
Right, okay. And what is the timeline that a insurance company might find out about a DWI? At what point in the process do they discover that you've been charged with a DWI?
Every policy, either at the time of issue or when it comes up for renewal. So if you have a 6 months policy, and let's say your policy runs from July to December, and you are convicted in October, then when they will rerun your MVR at the next renewal, which would be in December. And at that time, they would determine their course of action as far as stripping away coverages and lowering the liability limits and so forth.
Okay. I have a lot of clients, just to kind of follow up with.
Okay, as you can see, not only do you get the 350% increase, you can potentially lose your homeowner's insurance, excuse me, your parents' homeowner's insurance, or the discount because you're going to have to drop that particular car, that particular driver from your policy due to the fact it's too expensive. So now you can start seeing where it could be kind of costly for everybody. Alright, this next guy, he's the counselor I just mentioned earlier. He talks about how the misconceptions and the mathematical formula. He also shows us, it's kind of hard to see. Hopefully I can walk over and show you a little bit more. How much 08 really is. As I mentioned before, prior to doing this business, I didn't know either, and so this really helps clarify things.
The first segment we're going to take a look at, I'm going to talk about some of the misconceptions, the myths, some of the just bad information that surrounds where that number comes from, what creates that number, how large of an amount of alcohol this number represents, which is a huge misconception. And then talk about, again, where the idea and the number comes from. There's a formula that generates this. And then we're going to do a few examples of that number. I also, in the second segment, we're going to talk about the 5 things that are very common that cause blood alcohol level to rise, and the 2 things that actually have an impact on how quickly it drops, and a whole lot of myths around that. In the final segment, we're going to take a look at a chart that deals with comparing 2 people. One is a social drinker, one is an alcoholic, and we'll show the purpose of that when we get to that. One of the things that I do when we talk about this, I do this presentation in my education groups and occasionally in a treatment group as well. I want people to have an understanding from the very beginning, I guess. This number for years has represented a legal situation, but this number has a lot of other value and uses as well. It's not just a legal snare, and above a certain level they've got you, and you end up having to deal with whatever consequences your particular area requires as a result of a DUI or a DWI. But there's also a lot of clinical value and a lot of diagnostic value as well. So it has some other uses that you may not be aware of, and I'll bring those to you here as we go through this. I always like to start off with probably one of the biggest misconceptions about what blood alcohol level and that number actually means and represents. I always ask if anybody who's present has ever had their blood alcohol level measured, either as a result of some legal intervention or maybe in a treatment situation as a result of a hospitalization or an inpatient stay. And I'll ask for people just to kind of give me some examples of that number. And I always tell people as well, if you want to do I have a friend who, you certainly can do that as well. We'll start off with the two standards. Okay? Most people are very familiar with the old gold standard, 0.1, anything above that in the state of Maryland and in most states, that was considered the legal cutoff limit for a DWI. Several years ago, that limit dropped to an 0.8 and has been that way for a number of years now and is in a lot of states, if not most states in the country now. So again, I always ask if anybody wants to just kind of volunteer their number. And I don't do this to embarrass anybody. I don't do this to put anybody on the spot. I just use it as a point of reference as we go through some of these things. So anybody remember what their blood alcohol level may have been at one particular time or another? Okay. 0.17? Okay. Anything else? Okay. I also very often will hear the usual spread, 0.1, 0.11, 0.14. This number we'll come back to in a second. I always put a number up, and I use this sometimes as a hook. We do this over the course of a couple of sessions in the education program. I'm going to talk later on in the final segment about a patient that I had a number of years ago, and very unique situation, very unique story. Most people look at that number and just the number itself is pretty unique, but the situation that surrounded it shows that nothing's etched in stone, okay? Where this number comes from, and again, I've done this for a long, long time in a lot of different variations, a lot of different scenarios. I'll do it in group, I'll do it in sessions, I'll do it in treatment, I'll do it in education. I also, for years, did a number of presentations for the general public that dealt with this number, especially school groups, PTA meetings, community groups, people that wanted to have some understanding about blood alcohol level, especially around prom time or graduation time, where you'd have a little higher occurrence of drinking episodes. And so often I hear patients and clients make this comment, and I understand why, because the general public makes these comments as well. People for years have misinterpreted what that number actually represents. I've had people look at the old standard and say, well, geez, if 10% of a person's blood is alcohol, they should be arrested. If 52% of a person's blood is out, they ought to be dead, and kind of on and on and on. That number does not represent that large of an amount. And there's a formula that this is plugged into, and I'll show you that here in a few minutes. But again, like I said, people for years have talked about this number represents a larger amount. Very often I'll hear people that'll come in and they'll mention how much they had to drink, and did they do a breathalyzer? Yeah, and there had to be something wrong with the machine because I had XYZ to drink and I blew a 1.9, and there's no way in the world that 19% of my blood was alcohol, and that kind of. Again, that's not what that number represents. It's a much smaller amount than that. Just to show you as a little visual example, hopefully you can see this, and I use this as a prop in the education groups. When somebody says I couldn't possibly drink enough to get my blood alcohol level to 0.8, to the legal limit, if this amount of water in this measuring cup was alcohol, that's a DWI in the state of Maryland. And in most states, again, that have 0.8 as a limit. Well, most people, if I pass this around and they look at it, they're very often very surprised that it's not a whole lot. Now, to give you an idea, somebody always says, well, I don't drink, gin, and I don't. There's the same amount of alcohol in a 12-ounce beer that you find in about a 3-4 ounce glass of wine that you find in a shot glass of bourbon or whatever. So again, the amount of alcohol in those drinks is approximately the same. But again, if we're talking about just alcohol as a substance, this is a DWI, and most people certainly could drink that much alcohol in one sitting over the course of a couple of hours. So I want you to kind of keep this visual in mind as we go through this. Again, when people look at this number and say, I couldn't possibly drink enough, okay, where this number comes from is actually, it's a mathematical formula. It's not just a number they pulled out of the air. It's not just something they said, well, this will work and this will get them. There actually is some science behind this. What this number means, okay, that number represents parts of alcohol per 10,000 parts of blood. Okay? So you have a fraction, you have a ratio that this represents. Okay? Take our old standard, and we can do this with any number. When somebody says, I couldn't possibly drink, again, and you'll hear me mention that over and over again, I couldn't possibly drink enough to have 10% of my blood be alcohol. That's not what that number represents. Plug in the formula. Okay? The blood alcohol level of 0.1 is 10 parts of alcohol per 10,000 parts of blood. If you reduce that down to its lowest value, it's 1/10 of 1%. It's not 10% of anything, it's 1/10 of 1. Okay? So right away you can start to see that this is a much smaller amount than people think. When somebody says 10%, you're right, you couldn't. There's no way in the world you could drink that much. When somebody said, could you drink 1/10 of 1%? Well, all of a sudden, about what I had in that little measuring cup, that's what you're looking at, is an 0.8, in that range. So you certainly could.
Okay. Hopefully these 3 videos have been very informative for you. Just kind of give you an idea. The last video, if you can see this water, that's roughly what a 0.8 would look like. Maybe a little bit more, a little bit less. I'm trying to get where you can see more. But that's basically what he's saying. Could you drink 1/10 of 1%? Absolutely. If you were in my class, I could pass this water around, this amount of water. Everyone could drink that much. So it's not really uncommon for someone to go past 0.8 and not realize it. So that's why I'm drinking and driving. Just make a mental note that just don't do it. As you saw the consequences of the penalties, whether you go to jail, continuous alcohol monitoring, probation, whatever the case may be, is a big disturbance in your life. Not only the fact you could live with the fact that you've hurt someone or potentially killed someone, killed yourself, obviously that wouldn't be good either. Property damage on the car, property damage, at home or business or whatever, that could cause problems and very, very costly. Also too, the insurance. You get 12 insurance points, 350% increase. Some of you have really nice cars and you're going to pay 350% more. So that's 3.5 times more than what you're paying now. So that's kind of costly there, and that's for 3 years. That doesn't go away. That's if just like in the video, if they decide to keep you. If you're a teenager, 16, underage, you get DWI, they may just drop you all together and just say, no, we're not going to take that chance. Who knows? It's between you and the insurance company. Then you saw the little bit, like we just said, in the consequences. So hopefully this will help. We've got some more alcohol training or education to go with later on. I forgot to mention when we did Unit 5, the video for Unit 5 special code. So just put Unit 5 video, PowerPoint or whatever, and I'll know you saw it. This particular code, special code, is BTC 6873. BTC 6873. Thank you and look forward to seeing you in the next video.